According to my clock, it is 12:01. And I would like to welcome everyone to this month's Lunch and Learn. We're happy wherever you happen to be joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Today's session is delivering customer service through managed services and strategic staffing. And this is something that has been near and dear to our heart for many years. Gideon Taylor has been a longtime PeopleSoft and Oracle partner since shortly after our founding in 2001, providing a wide range of services for organizations around the world. My name is Scott Anton with Gideon Taylor, and a few housekeeping items before I introduce our speaker today. We are recording this webinar, and we'll go ahead and send out a link to the recording probably early next week. So you can expect to see that from us, and feel free to share that. You'll also be able to find that the recording on YouTube as well as on our website. These Lunch and Learns are events that we host on a monthly basis. They frequently focus on some of our proprietary solutions and services, namely GT eForms, our IDA digital assistant, our WebUX user experience tools. And then they also dive into PeopleSoft services, PeopleSoft solutions. So we hope that you join us for other Lunch and Learn webinars as we go throughout the course of the year. If you have any questions, feel free to post those in either the chat or the Q&A. We will keep an eye on those throughout the course of the webinar and take a pause to respond to some of those. We also may choose to hold some of those until the end, but feel free to post those when they come to mind. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce today's speaker. Scott Crutchfield is our practice lead for our Managed Services and Staffing Services division. And he's going to walk us through some of the exciting offerings that Gideon Taylor offers, but also some real-world customer success stories based on a variety of different staffing models that we provide. Scott, it is all yours.
All right. Thank you, Scott. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn. I hope everyone's doing great today and is ready to hear about managed services and strategic staffing for PeopleSoft and how it might benefit your business. All righty, let's get started. A little bit about myself. Many years ago now, I worked with PeopleSoft and IBM, running large engagements and leveraging a lot of resources to do so. I then moved on to IT executive management for a large multinational security company. I ran development and business systems and then was the CIO for a good long period of time. Suffice it to say, I've looked at managed services and staffing across a diverse group of countries, businesses, and business problems. Scott said, I'm currently responsible for GT's managed services and strategic staffing practices. Working with higher education, public sector, and enterprise organizations to build support models that keep PeopleSoft stable, current, and aligned to your business goals. With decades of experience in PeopleSoft service delivery, I've been able to help many organizations navigate complex transitions, reduce support costs, and build sustainable IT operations. I have looked at this managed services and staffing problem from both sides, both from consulting and an industry perspective. I've had many successes, a few disappointments here and there, and I've learned a lot in the process. Okay, so why does this conversation matter right now? PeopleSoft environments continue to anchor mission-critical HR, finance, and campus solutions workloads. Teams are really stretched thin due to retirements, attrition, shrinking internal benches, and really PeopleSoft skills are hard to find. There's a lot of pressure to modernize, cloud, integrations, UX, AI, you name it, and businesses want us to do that without destabilizing the core business processes. Hopefully, today you'll walk away with an understanding of the common problems that other GT customers have had and how we've helped them solve them. Alrighty, this is the agenda for today. Every organization running PeopleSoft faces fundamental tension. pressure to keep up mission-critical systems and keeping them stable and performing while simultaneously preparing for tomorrow. And what's coming tomorrow is coming really fast. I mean, honestly, faster than ever that I've seen. New regulations, cloud mandates, major upgrades, workforce changes. Unfortunately, the demands don't stop, and neither does the expectation that your system is just going to work. What we found, working with the organizations that we're going to talk about today with ASGN, BDO, BSRA, BYU, and Wakefern, is that organizations who navigate this best aren't the ones who choose between stability and change. They're the ones that build a model that delivers both at the same time. So today I'm going to walk you through exactly how this model works, how we combine managed services with strategic staffing to keep your PeopleSoft environment healthy, how we've helped organizations like yours succeed through complex transitions, and how we think about building an IT service delivery model that is sustainable for the long term. Lastly, we want to talk to you about how Gideon Taylor might be able to help you on this journey. Let's get into it. All righty, your team's holding the system together. Who's moving the business forward? All right, what are some of the challenges that folks are facing? Here are a few. The backlog. Your best people are stuck in break-fix mode when they genuinely should be driving change for your organizations. Expertise. Deep PeopleSoft knowledge doesn't grow on trees, and the talent market knows it. Turnover. When a key person leaves, they take years of institutional knowledge with them. Budgets. Headcount freezes don't pause when your workload doubles, and budgets don't flex, of course. And then projects don't wait. Upgrades, migrations, new initiatives land whether you want them to or not. It's the classic tension. Keep the lights on, or can we drive meaningful change? Just a little something on why traditional models might fall short. For an FTE, you might need, I'm going to give you an example. You might need a senior OCI architect for a 3-month project to move everything on-premise to the cloud. But hiring one means a 60-day recruiting cycle, onboarding lag, and a big salary with benefits for a project scope need when it doesn't need to be. Big bang consulting projects, the consulting team drives execution of the project. When it's deployed, a lot of the talent and knowledge leaves, leaving the organization short of the desired result. Pure staff aug, example, staff aug developer writes the code, passes QA, and no one owns the technical debt if the contractor leaves the engagement. Without embedded leadership, staff aug teams need constant direction, internal managers who are already at capacity, creating a bottleneck for the problem that you actually want to solve. FTEs optimize for performance, consultants optimize for deliverables, and staff aug optimize for head count. But most real-world problems require outcomes delivered with continuity, which none of these deliver expressly on their own. Alrighty, what if you didn't have to choose between keeping the lights on and moving the business forward? All right, this is the hybrid support model that we want to talk about today. The breakdown, I'll go from left to right here. The idea is that the internal team maintains, sets the direction and owns the outcomes. They manage vendors and stakeholders, and they carry institutional knowledge forward. They're focused on what only they can do. They own the outcome. What this means is that depending on the relationship with the MSP or SSP, this can vary a little bit. As we go through our cases, I'll point out examples of where we've owned a little more of what the internal team does, or vice versa. They've owned more of the managed, what the managed services would encompass. It really depends on the customer's requirements. So as we go left to right, managed services, you absorb the day-to-day support and backlog, handle break fix, enhancements, pump cycles in case of PeopleSoft, deliver things that predictable cost and coverage for you. So SLAs and costs are set so that you don't have to wonder. It extends your team without expressly expanding your headcount. And then lastly, we have strategic staffing. This is essentially on-demand specialists for the right moment. We bring surge capacity in for upgrades, migrations, other special projects that you might have. It helps you close skills gaps without long-term commitments. Essentially, you get the right people at the right time, right on. As you can see in the bottom here of the slide, it talks about kind of things escalating left to right. And what you'll find as we go through the different customers, what we've been able to do is we'll scale up depending on what the customer needs, and we scale down, working closely with the customer when the need is diminished. And I think I'm pretty sure in almost every case that we're going to go through today, that's what's happened. So it doesn't have to be an all or nothing kind of thing. Why are we doing this? We want managed services, so they can focus on the core layer, give you a steady base, strategic staffing plugged in for spikes as you go along, and then your internal team could then be freed up for strategy, governance, business partnership, all those things that you want your internal folks doing. Go to the next slide. The model works that what we just described. I'm going to show you a few case studies, 5 of them to be exact, of how it's worked for other customers, so you can get a real world example. It's pretty interesting. I put this slide together just to kind of show you kind of the different things that these customers are doing, but also to show you how the ownership breaks down. Let me go over the slide here. So the ownership's column is here. This is important, and I think you'll get this more as we go through it. We won't spend much time on it now, but at the end, I'll kind of go through it, give you a recap, and give you some thoughts. All right, let's start with the first customer, ASGN. ASGN has been a long-term customer of Gideon Taylor. They're a leading provider of IT and professional services, serving commercial enterprises and governments across the United States. The challenge they were having at the time, they had a long-term relationship with an offshore managed services partner, and they were underperforming at the time. They were exiting the PeopleSoft space and moving to the Workday space, the provider I'm talking about. This big change left ASGN's PeopleSoft environments unstable, unsupported, at a very critical moment, as it happens, that they were also moving to Workday, but not leveraging that vendor. So what was GT's approach when we came in there? Well, it happened, I think it was like 5 days before Christmas, about 3 years ago. So our approach was to deploy a combination of managed services and strategic staffing resources. A core team to begin with, and then as we learned more, we developed it more, covering daily support and whatever active project work might be necessary. There was going to be a month-long transition where we do shadowing, reverse shadowing, and finally GT would assume support. We had to do that very quickly because the incumbent wanted to exit really fast. I think it was a month. That's somewhat uncommon. Most don't want to exit so quickly, but yeah, we were able to handle it. And then the results. Although there were challenges, GT was able to quickly assume control of things like PeopleSoft administration. We stabilized the environment, and we remediated a big backlog and actually added to it too when we found things as we went along. And quickly, we were able to stabilize things. And on the project side, we were also able to get those going properly as well. And at a high level, ASGN is now on Workday. A little more detail. GT already had a relationship providing strategic staffing for skilled developers with ASGN. When we were asked to do this, starting in December and taking things over for the old MSP, yeah, it seemed like a pretty nice challenge. They had been using that vendor for many years. I think it was over 15. The transition was friendly, but it was a crash course. Yeah, we completed the handoff in about 6 weeks, and the previous vendor terminated their services. I think we had a few calls with them after that, and that was it. Um, However, I mean, we did that section. This turned out to be pretty complicated, though, because there was more to come. There was an ongoing project that was going on with ASGN. They wanted to move a couple of their subsidiaries onto PeopleSoft, and the prior vendor had been working on it. And it wasn't going well. So we had to mobilize a team to make that happen pretty quickly. Fortunately, we were able to do that. We got the project completed, and then we flexed back to the original intent, which was the managed services engagement with a lean team. Given the outflow of knowledge from the organization, this particular customer leaned a lot on GT, which is fine. Like I said, we can flex on those things. We can take more responsibility if necessary. In this case, we provided senior engagement management and senior architects as needed to help with things like strategic direction around PeopleSoft. We would frame everything up for the customer and provide options to make decisions, for them. They were, as I said earlier, they were focused on Workday, so they weren't in the day to day like we were. Fortunately, GT has these kind of resources to bring. So we were able to engage with the customer and give them that level of service relatively easily. ASGN had a few folks with institutional knowledge, as the former MSP had most of it. So one or two of those folks remained, and the GT team was able to build on both our knowledge in the transition and the knowledge of those folks to keep things stable and moving forward. In the relationship, GT had more kind of what you would consider the customer responsibilities. Like I said, that's okay. We have the folks to do it if necessary. In this case, it was necessary. We didn't have keep current services in this case, as they needed a full service team to support the day to day. Unfortunately, they weren't staffed to take it over. From a day to day perspective. When the incumbent had run things for so long. Project's gone well. Customers now in Workday, and GT is helping to service things for them. We've archived all their PeopleSoft environments, and we're giving them kind of a minimal. It's the extreme flex back to the left. I think we provide for a number of resources, probably 5 hours a week of support, so that their audit people and their accountants and all that can use their archive environments and get back the data and information they need. But yeah, this was a varied one. It went well in the end, and the customer is on the new platform. All right, another example is BDO. BDO is a large professional services network delivering accounting, tax, advisory, and consulting services around the world. Their challenge, they were moving to Oracle Fusion Cloud while simultaneously trying to support PeopleSoft Finance while they were doing the transition. It already moved to HR some time before. GT put together a hybrid model, leveraging onshore and nearshore resources. We defined weekly thresholds for the resources, giving the BDO team kind of immediate ability to capitalize on the resources while keeping the budget in check for them. It went really well. It was a very good experience for both sides. GT assumed responsibility for the critical business process really within a few weeks from them. We did the shadowing, the reverse shadowing, and assuming the responsibility. I think it was about 2 weeks, doing all that. The ticket rates improved significantly, the ticket closure rates. The open ticket volume declined steadily as we worked through things and got more familiar. And then lastly, the support costs were actually reduced material within the first few months of what our expectations were to what we were actually the costs that were actually being provided. Contrasting BDO with ASGN, BDO was quite different in its approach and how we worked with them. BDO, for the most part, ran all of its day-to-day support and special projects needs. However, when they didn't have time or the specialized skill to complete something, they would come to GT for strategic staffing. So through the years, GT was used in this capacity primarily. We would do strategic staffing for BDO and handle either things that were too complicated for their folks, or they didn't have time to do them. But in 2024, when they came to us with this support issue, they're looking for really a hybrid model to help them address, their ticket count. And really, we were able to quickly mobilize a nearshore team with, several functional experts and onshore support managers. So we had, kind of a variety of folks from a geography standpoint. And this helped with cost too. The part of the equation. The team quickly became really a part of the middle pillar that I showed you earlier. So the MSP or the support side, but worked as an extension of the internal team. They were just really, they became a part of the team in the period that we were there. It worked out well for the customer. GT was really able to come and reduce things, as I said. This was done at about the budget that was expected when we started. And we passed on those savings to the customer. And this enabled them to use these resources for really double the amount of time that was expected while they were preparing to go to the new platform. So it was a great experience. And we were, like I said, we were able to do it for a much better rate than we expected. It's also a great example of a customer that's used this for, strategic staffing, but, brought us in for MSP, and we were able to the flex and help them with that. And this was a very specific case, and we had to work through it. But yeah, again, we have the capacity to do that. All right, the next customer, BSRA. So Savannah River National Lab, or SRNL. I don't know if I'm not looking at the slide, but it is DOE's premier environmental management laboratory, delivering science and technology solutions for the nation's $6 billion annual nuclear waste cleanup program. BSRA was the entity awarded to manage SRNL. I think it was in 2020. The challenge that they had when BSRA was awarded, they inherited really an impossible deadline with just 120 days to stand up a fully independent PeopleSoft financials instance, completely separate from the incumbent contractor systems to support a 1,000-person national lab from day one. Really, there's no margin for error. They, went through the process. They selected GT, and we moved fast. We rapidly assembled a dedicated delivery team and built a standalone PeopleSoft financials environment from the ground up, standing up core financials, retrofitting customizations from the predecessor system, and engineering the interface agreements that would be required to interact with all the entities in a similar way going forward. So that was the approach. We were able to execute on it in 120 days, and BSRA went live on time, delivering a fully operational PeopleSoft environment, enabling SNRNL and BSRA, the managing entity, to launch independent operations at that time. Through the stabilization, GT transitioned seamlessly to really a lean, right-sized, ongoing management support services for them. We ran that all the way through the period of time that they needed. About halfway through, they decided that they were going to move to Oracle Cloud, and again, we helped them the middle, beginning, and end to get to that goal. This is another great example of kind of flexing up and down as necessary. Big project at the beginning, we had to flex up. When we finished, the core of the work that had to be done, we flexed down and managed support all the way through. And then we actually flexed down even further as we were supporting similar to, ASGN, their archive environments and the things that need to be done in that situation. So we flexed down continuously all the way to, to when they got to the new platform. So, let's see. And in this case, GT really became a part of the internal team. A lot of the kind of day-to-day operations and things like that, we were driving a lot of the activity with their senior leadership, making decisions, with us kind of bringing things fully formed so that, busy people can make decisions quickly. So we were able to put that together and have a very successful project and MSP and service engagement with them. All right, BYU. I got a couple more of these, and then we'll move on. And I'm looking at the time, and it's Scott and Anton. If you can keep me honest here, I would appreciate it. BYU, obviously a very large private university. They serve a diverse global student body with strong commitment to innovation and operational excellence. The challenge, another customer that was moving to something else. In BYU's case, they're moving to Workday for their finance and human resources systems. And they had reassigned 12 admin staff to the Workday project. So we were brought in to reduce the amount of folks that were required to do that work and improve quality if we could. Our approach, we didn't just look at it backfilling. We were looking to raise the bar. We took on full responsibility for campus, finance, HR, with a leaner team. Introducing things like automated workflows and smart solutions designed to reduce manual data entry and accelerate campus solutions. The result, we were able to cut the support staff in half. Using a mix of onshore and nearshore resources while simultaneously improving service quality. Obviously, the automation initiatives helped across the three pillars, delivering more with less, bringing BYU's internal team to stay focused on the Workday transition. Since GT has been working with BYU there have been requirements to flex the team, up and down as business requirements have changed over the years. The steady state is performing managed services, as we said, including admin services, development work, and some BA work. However, since we began the contract, BYU's flexed its finance and it's moved its finance and human resources systems to Workday, so that was successful. We flexed up to provide resources to help with that as well. Once it was complete, the team flexed down again. So across all these customers, you can see a pattern here. Pay very close attention to what the customer needs, keen eye on the budget, and we flex up and down as necessary to meet their needs. All right, I have one more for you. This is Wakefern. Wakefern is the largest retail-owned cooperative in the United States. They are a PeopleSoft shop, and the challenge, they are also moving HR and finance to a new platform. So they needed their teams fully focused on the transition, and they wanted PeopleSoft to obviously keep running critical operations. They wanted to bring in a trusted partner to make sure that happened. In the end, that was GT. What was our approach? In this case, we deployed our Keep Current managed service and took full ownership of Wakefern's PeopleSoft updates, patches, maintenance cycles, beyond ongoing upkeep. GT also provided strategic staffing for a couple of things that have come up for Wakefern and continue to do so. The results, Wakefern's PeopleSoft environment is fully current during the duration of the migration. There's been zero disruption to HR, finance, operations. Our staffing model has allowed Wakefern to scale up and down as demand shifted, and they haven't sacrificed business continuity. Going back to our model, Wakefern really owns everything to the left. There, the GT provides, the keep current in the middle for managed services, and as needed, we provide strategic staffing to them for specific things that they're looking for. But their team, maintains ownership of a lot of that. So you can see, I'll go to the next slide because this kind of gives you a summary of everything that we talked about. These are all the customers. This is the ownership level, and these are the services that I've chosen to depict in this case. So you can see the ownership can vary. So for BSRA and ASGN, GT owned a lot more of the support process and some of the strategy. I mean, the decisions always are made by the customer, but there were things that needed to happen that way in those cases, and we were able to flex and do it. In the case of I'll call them orange, yellow boxes, the customer was the owner. We just provided either a service or resources that they need to solve the specific problem at a specific time. And then, like with BYU, we have joint ownership where we're working it together on those things. So hopefully this has demonstrated that with customers that are existing customers, we've been able to provide flexible solution really for whatever needs they might have. All right. We showed you the five customers with the GT hybrid model to meet day-to-day supports. And always flex up. How do we build sustainable IT service delivery model that gets your organization what it needs, but it doesn't break the budget? Right. So I've given the client examples, as I said. I wanted to give you some examples of when you might want to amp things up to meet your organization's needs. So things like cloud migrations, you want to move to the cloud and you don't have the experience needed to feel comfortable. The difference between a smooth migration and a painful one is having the right architects and migration leads available at the right time, not 6 months later. People tools and POM upgrades. Your team is tied up on new strategic initiatives and can't seem to keep up with all the patching required to keep things up to date. Our Keep Current service eliminates the upgrade burden entirely. For organizations managing it themselves, surge capacity means your core team stays focused without burning out. So we can also surge for you if the Keep Current is not something that you're interested in. I will say, when you see the Keep Current pricing, which I'll show you shortly, you may never want to go back. I know in my position before, I wouldn't. I would buy it every time. Things like reorgs, mergers and acquisitions, and leadership transition. Your team's working tons of hours a week doing normal support, and your company acquires another company, does a reorg, or is changing leadership. And when do they get that work done? When internal knowledge is in flux, continuity doesn't happen by accident. The right support model keeps operations stable while your organization finds its footing. Okay, there's a pattern. The bigger the initiative, the more layers of the model compound in value. Managed services holds the foundation, and strategic staffing delivers the expertise. Together, they can make an impossible timeline possible for you. Alrighty, the right support model starts with honest answers to these 4 questions. Where are your single points of failure? If one person left tomorrow, what would break? Most organizations know the answers, and most haven't done anything about it yet. What's sitting in your backlog that never seems to move? Backlogs aren't just an efficiency problem. They're a signal that your current model isn't scaled to work on the things that your organization actually needs to get done. And what skills do you need or will you need in the next 12 to 24 months that you don't have today? Things like cloud migrations, upgrades, new modules that don't wait for the hire. The organizations that move fastest already have access to the expertise before they need it. Is your team spending time on work that actually moves the business forward? If your best people are buried in break fix and routine maintenance, the answer is probably no. And that's a strategic problem, not just an operational one. Alrighty. All right, if any of that sounded familiar, if it resonates, you're probably in the right place. So let's talk about how GT can help you on this journey. Alrighty, this slide provides some examples of how you might leverage either GT managed services or secure solutions in your organization. So reducing your operational burden. Your internal team is talented but stretched. You need them focused on strategic work, not buried in tickets, patches, and routine maintenance that never seems to end. GT can help here. You're moving to a new ERP and can't afford to let PeopleSoft support slip in the meantime. This transition could take years. Your users can't wait that long for help. GT can help here. Your expertise and skill level, maybe you're not there. Your most experienced PeopleSoft people are retiring, and finding qualified replacements is harder than it's ever been. Knowledge gap is real and it's growing. GT can help here. SLAs, you need a support partner who commits to response time, resolution rates, and service levels in writing and actually delivers them. GT can help here. And lastly, you're on your OCI cloud journey, you're planning a migration to Oracle Cloud infrastructure, and you've already made the move, and need ongoing management from a team that's been there and done that and can help you. GT can help you. Over all of these things, I think GT approaches this by balancing your budget and resource needs. So we'll have a conversation about these things and dig in detail and make sure that they balance. I'm looking at time here. I think I've got about 10 or 13 minutes. So I may gloss over some of these things so that we can make sure that we finish on time. But here we have some examples of the different areas that GT can support you and your organization. We cover all the bases for application and functional, as well as infrastructure and operational. You can see here we do L1 to L3 support, and we can vary these. They don't have to be one person full time always. We can vary them depending on what your need is. Development support, retrofits, new business requirements, special projects. Strategic advisory, that's a good one. We have senior level folks that can come in and help you with those things in the manner that you need exactly. Infrastructure and operation, POM and patch management. We talked about keep current. We also have very skilled database and system administration help for you. Cloud hosting, which we've talked about a couple times. Governance and service management, and special projects. Now, special projects, that's kind of wide open on both sides here. Enhancements, integrations, new features, whatever you need. All righty. Why would you use Gideon Taylor? Hopefully, if you're on this call, you've had a very good experience with Gideon Taylor in the past, and not much selling is required, but 20 years experience, over 20 years experience, PeopleSoft. On our typical engagement, every consultant that's involved has at least 15 plus years of experience. Obviously deep platform, experience in HCM, FSCM, campus. Well, this whole conversation has been talking about flexible models that we provide. No two organizations are alike. As you can see from this presentation, we build engagements around your operational reality and budget. Targeted PEL support to manage operations, not the other way around. Proven cloud migration, I think we talked about that. We have comprehensive coverage. We cover every layer. Database, systems admin, app support, user facing, nothing falls through the cracks. It does. We also work within your system. We operate, in your existing ticketing systems, teams, change management workflows from day one. No new portals to learn, no disruption in how your team has to work. And then lastly, we focus on long-term partnership. We focus on knowledge transfer and continuous improvement through every engagement, hopefully leaving your organization stronger and more capable, not more dependent upon us. I don't think it's here on the slide, but all of this is GT's access to top talent marketplace is all dependent on that. Across the PeopleSoft landscape, we have the ability to bring exactly what is needed to meet your requirements. All right. I'm not going to go through all these either, given the time constraints. Yeah, I'll just call out a couple of them. Communication is very key for us. We believe in clarity and transparency, a foundation for any successful engagement and, frankly, relationship. You'll always know where things stand. No surprises, no spin. It's upfront. Obviously, professionalism. We feel very strongly about this. That the folks we bring to the table are going to act in this way. All these are important, but it comes down to trust. You build trust through transparency, follow through, and honest communication, which we feel we do. We treat it as the most important thing we can earn from a client, and we definitely don't take it for granted. Already, we've had some results. We've talked about some of these. I won't go through them again. You can see here on the right here, 100 plus customer served since 2004. Yeah, that's a sizable number across the spectrum of services and products that we provide. Yeah. And let's see. Okay, yeah, this is one I wanted to spend a little more time on. So to make sure that folks understand it, this I believe is the last slide before the Q&A. So going from left to right, I told you I was going to tell you about Keep Current. And I believe the most cost-effective way to stay current without consuming internal resources is our Keep Current offering. GT handles tools upgrades, column updates, CPU, tax updates. You can see it all here. DBA updates, UAT on a predictable schedule, so your team never has to think about it. And it's at a very reasonable price. You can see MSRP here is $3,000 per pillar or environment, meaning that I'll just give you an example. If you have one HCM environment that has one production environment, but not just one production, but all normal development and up to production. But it's the way we price it. One production environment to service ultimately. Everything can be done. It's $3,000 a month times 12 for 36 grand per year. That's MSRP. And at the bottom, you see that depending on complexity, scope, and service level, that might change. But predominantly, it's either this or less, depending, if it's a normal complexity level, which I find be a very good deal. And you just don't have to worry about all these things, and you have very skilled, capable folks that you can trust taking care of it for you. So. Yeah, if you want to talk about that, me and other folks would certainly be happy to do so. On the app side, we apps and ops support. We can do, as we said earlier, we can do L1, L2, L3. We can provide a layer to do, support management and KPI reporting. We can structure all that. 24/7 report is available as well. And for budget purposes, we do have very skilled capabilities, both onshore and nearshore, to meet these requirements, which is helpful at times when customers are looking to maximize their budget, right? OCI hosting, we can do, from the migration planning all the way through to the hosting and soup to nuts for you, and you don't have to worry about it. I don't have specific pricing on this here, but it's also very reasonable. And then they're called auxiliary services, but different things that we can do for you on a time and material or managed services basis. That is, I think that's the Q&A. Before we start Q&A, and I got there here around the time I wanted to. We got about, I think, 15 minutes left. So if we have Q&A, we can go through it. Just to start, we're happy to offer a follow-up, no pressure assessment conversation with you, sample support model workthrough, or a deeper dive into one of the customers that we talked about today. Yeah, just reach out, and happy to engage with you. You're going to see my contact information here in a bit at the end. I think we have a couple more things that we're going to go through. But now we'll open it up for questions. Scott, I think you've been monitoring questions. If there are questions there, if you can them, and I'll answer them to the best of my ability.
Yeah, it is right now. It is quiet. I
Okay.
had a comment though. I love what you've presented, and one of the things that we find is that organizations spend a lot of time planning and executing these projects, and typically they're on like an every other year basis, where
Yeah.
they'll get caught up on PUM updates, they'll get caught up on tools, and so much time is spent during those projects. And I think that there is relatively little time spent on the nice to haves, on
Yeah.
being able to evaluate new features and new functionality, and considering uptaking that stuff and actually applying some of these new releases to improve your user satisfaction, to improve your productivity, your efficiency, and ultimately make PeopleSoft easier to manage going forward. There's just so much that
Absolutely.
Oracle continues to release. I attended the Blueprint conference a couple of weeks ago, and then also attended a local user group meeting here in the Twin Cities yesterday, and got a chance to sit in on Sashank Vamana's roadmap sessions from Oracle for what's coming down the pipe. And I am always amazed at these conferences that Oracle continues to put so much investment in PeopleSoft and in People Tools. And I think that as consumers of that, as organizations that are using PeopleSoft, it's incumbent to see how that stuff can impact your organization, and being able to outsource certain activities that you've outlined in the call today, while being able to then focus my internal staff on that kind of strategic value, that kind of uptake, I think is a big benefit.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, no, and just to add to that, Scott, just to say you have three pillars. You could, do the three pillars for less than what a full-time, much less, probably half of what a full-time FTE would cost. Because you get it all, you get sysadmin, you get PeopleSoft admin, you get DBA, you get it all packaged in, and you get experts from our team doing it for you. It's, for me, it's a no-brainer. But no, it's all good. But yeah, I appreciate that, because yeah, folks, definitely, you get into these projects and your head's down, you're trying to get it done, and that's the focus, and you don't really have a lot of time to do the other stuff, unfortunately.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah, there are a lot of people talking about the new landing pages that are available, but if you're not up to speed on the latest PUM images and tools, you're kind of out of the game in terms of being able
Yeah.
to take advantage of that stuff. It would be fantastic if I'm sitting in a user's shoes, and I see a new video announcement of Oracle promoting some new feature or function within the latest releases. It'd be great to think that, oh my gosh, my organization can take advantage of that. We're up on the latest releases. I can go ahead and put a call out to somebody and say, hey, let's take a serious look at this. But there are
Absolutely.
definitely organizations that just aren't in that position yet.
Yeah. No, that's right. That's right. So do we have any questions? We have a few more slides that are kind of, after the presentation, if there are no questions.
No, I think we can go ahead and move on
Okay.
with those slides.
All right. I will do that. Okay.
Fantastic.
Just a couple key takeaways. Yeah, I think you've heard it throughout. You can, align your support model with your organization's goals. Don't choose between keeping the lights on and driving the business forward. You can build a model that you can do both. Um, combining managed services and staffing, on-demand staffing for flexible, cost-effective approach is a great way to go. Give you the right people at the right time, and the right solution, hopefully. Yeah, I would say evaluate your current support structure, and that's something that we can help you do. Again, going back to if you want to do a 30-minute session, happy to jump on a call, talk through what you have, what your challenges are, and how we can flex and give you a solution that is going to meet your operational needs as well as your budget needs. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Alicia to talk about upcoming training news.
Great. So we do want to share. We're really grateful to Scott for his presentation today, and just wanted to share our upcoming Lunch and Learn. So in June, we have a presentation talking about how to apply PeopleSoft PUM images and CPUs with minimal downtime. So if you or somebody in your organization manages or handles those PUM and image upgrades, this would be a great session for you to attend and get some great tips and tricks on how to really be effective in that and to minimize any downtime you might have. And then July, we get into some AI. So top 10 AI questions you're not asking. This will be by our AI division will come and share some of the really important questions to be thinking about as you consider AI. So this will be another great session. Up next, just a couple of things related to training. This may or may not apply to you, but we are introducing some new training offerings that will be coming out. So anyone that might be a WebUX customer of ours, we are now offering 7 different courses that will cover different aspects and pieces of WebUX. So if your team is using that product or any of those products, just be aware that we now offer training on how to help and support your teams as they support your WebUX product, and those are available to you. And then last but not least, we have a nice slide that covers all of our upcoming eForms trainings. So these are all kind of our shorter duration courses, with the exception of the one there, the second line down, the Intro to GT eForms. So if you are an eForms customer, this is our comprehensive week-long training course that really gives you that deep dive into how to configure, how to use your GT eForms product. So those, if you were to pull up your phone and use that QR code there, that will take you to our registration form to register for and sign up for any of these courses.
Awesome. And quick question from you, Scott. Do we share this presentation so that they could get to the QR code later if they want to?
We don't share the deck, but we do share the recording. So they'll absolutely be able to access that later on.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah. Well, I'm going to go to the next slide. This is my my contact information. So feel free to reach out, email. I think, my cell number's on there as well. Feel free to text, call, email. I'm okay. If you're ready to explore what a hybrid model could look like for your organization, let's start a conversation.
Awesome. I'm going to put in one final plug for those 2 upcoming Lunch and Learns. We delivered both of those sessions at the recent Blueprint conference, and they were very popular. We had 50 plus attendees in both of those, the PUM and tools maintenance one, and the top 10 questions that you're not asking your AI provider. So I highly encourage folks to join those for June and July. Great sessions with a lot of good, valuable knowledge to take away. All right. Oh, any closing comments, Scott?
No, I'm good.
Very good. Well, thank you very much for sharing this afternoon. Thanks everyone for attending. We look forward to seeing you on a future Lunch and Learn. Take care.
Everyone.